Hello, welcome to Bumbling Through Dungeons. My name is Mark. Today we're talking about a topic that it's going to touch on D&D, but it's going to jump around a little bit, and that's the topic of ghosting. Not ghosts, but ghosting. So let's dive in. So I want to start off with a story about one of my personal heroes, Fred Rogers, better known as Mr. Rogers of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood fame. And a lot of people loved Mr. Rogers. I was no exception. And one of the many sweet, wonderful stories surrounding Mr. Rogers is that every morning he would wake up really early and he would spend an hour a day in the morning, sometimes more, writing response letters to children who would write him. And eventually, got to the point where he would get so many letters that he couldn't respond to them all himself, but he would do everything he could to get back to each one of them in some form, even if it had to be through an assistant. Now, I don't actually know if this is true or not. I've seen some of the documentaries, I've read his biography. This particular story I think might be apocryphal. It might be something that may or may not have been completely true, but it certainly rings true given everything else that we know about Fred Rogers. And it's heartwarming because he's spending personal time to respond on a one-to-one basis to somebody else. So I've tried to take this mentality into my life with varied success because the idea of ghosting, of not showing up and not saying anything, has become, I think, unfortunately, a little bit too standard sometimes in our deliberations with other people. Now, if you work in a workplace where you have to deal with a gigantic inbox of emails every day, you know what I'm talking about. You prioritize your emails, you respond to the ones that you have to. Usually those are the ones from your immediate supervisor or boss or bosses, and a lot of the others might take a while to get to, and there are a certain number that you might not respond to. Now, this, to a certain extent, is something like that could be seen as, a necessity to stay sane, to continue with the productive work that you need to be doing as part of your job. And I'm not a productivity expert, but there are a lot of people who have a lot of good advice about situations like that, about ways that you can avoid those problems in the first place by managing your professional circle. This isn't a topic about that, but I'm touching on a few different things related to this topic of ghosting. As it relates to D&D, I think this means the most when we're talking about out of game, like the player, not the in character PC, but us just showing up for D&D sessions. Now, anyone who's tried to create and run and keep together a D&D group knows that usually one of the hardest, if not the hardest things about it is getting people to commit. On the one hand, this is very understandable because we all have busy lives. We all have routines that we're in, and spending any amount of time, usually at least one night a week, or if you play on the weekends, it could be during the day for most of us, but spending 4 hour chunk of time minimum per week on something can be a big ask. Now, certainly there are ways that you can get around this. Find a time that works for everyone. You clear out your schedule, you form your week and your habits and your other errands around the fact that you have this night. And for me, when I think about all of the hobbies that I've had in my life, and there have been quite a few of them, the amount of time I spend on D&D actually isn't higher than most of them. The amount of time that I might spend on others, it might not be a 3 to 5 hour chunk every week, but when you add up all the time, it's as much or more as I spend on D&D. Now, for me, that's a little bit different because I have a YouTube channel, I have a blog, I have a website, I create DM's Guild products. I'm spending time on that, but I'm really only talking about time spent either preparing for or playing the game itself. So what are some strategies that you can take either as someone who's trying to form a group or keep it together, or who's looking to join a group? So I think if you're a player, you have the easier task. Because if we're being honest, once you sort of create your character, there could be a little bit of upfront work, and then as you're leveling your character, you have some decisions to make. But most of the time, leveling can be done in 5 to 15 minutes, depending on whether or not you're actually writing it in on a character sheet or using one of the online character generators like D&D Beyond or one of the others that's out there. And so it's not a whole lot of work. Your main commitment is showing up and playing. And I think that as a player, that is one of the most valuable things that you can do, is to be someone who is reliable. Now, things come up. You're not going to make every session. If you play weekly, you're not going to make 52 sessions out of the year. Or if you do, good for you. You have your life together more so than I do. But the point is, if you can be consistently reliable, people are going to value that in you. And I see groups form, and then they'll break up for reasons related to people's lives getting busier. Nothing bad, it just happens, where groups form and split and reform and resplit, and sometimes there's new people that join. And when someone is committed to playing D&D and making sure they have a group or two going at the same time, you can tell that they value those who are reliable, because it's a lot less work to make it work. Because if you're looking to form a game, maybe you only have 3 friends who are interested, so those are the 3 friends that you're going to play with. But if you have choices, then who are you going to go to first? Maybe it's the people that you know the best, but a lot of times it's going to be the people that you know will be the most committed and that you'll also enjoy playing with. So the groups that I've formed a lot of times have been either formed or joined, have been comprised of people that I know, but some of them are more acquaintances than good friends, but I know that they're going to be able to make that commitment. And on the other hand, communication is key if you're a player. If you're not going to be able to make it, let your DM know in advance. Again, things come up last minute. Sometimes you have to be like, oh my God, I can't make it tonight, and it's just before the session starts. Things like that do happen. Apologize when it does. You're going to be fine. People should be understanding, and in my experience, largely they have been. So communicating beforehand is key, and being able to make that commitment. So it's the person who would forget that, it's the person who's going to forget that you have a session and then show up 45 minutes late, so they need to be caught up. That's the person that's going to make it logistically harder for you to have a coherent campaign, for you to have a set time that you meet every week, and really for everything else about the game to come together as well as it can. These things have to be in place first. Now, occasionally I'm speaking from experience here, but if I'm being perfectly honest, for the most part, the groups that I've played with have been really great in these areas. People have to miss here and there, but it's always understandable. They always communicate it as soon as they know. And so I feel like I've been lucky, is what I feel like to a certain extent. And I talk to other people who have tried to form groups or have joined groups, and they have a really hard time keeping them together. And I realized that, the groups that I've had together for a year or 2 years or 3 years, largely with the same core group, I am lucky to have that. And it's because I've been able to find people who are able to make the commitment and be consistent about it, and create their lives in such a way that it works for them. And as a GM, so game master, dungeon master, whatever we're calling it, if you're the DM, you're not necessarily the one forming the group. You're not necessarily the one coordinating the group. I've found a lot of times that does end up being the case. Whoever's running the group is the one who, sets the meeting times and makes sure that everyone's coming and lets you know, okay, we're leveling up here and we're not meeting next week because of this. It makes a certain amount of sense that the person running the game is the person running the group, but it's a lot of extra effort. So, first of all, if you don't want to take on that responsibility, but you do want to be a DM for a game, talk to your group so that somebody else can be the logistics person while you're the DM, so that it isn't too much for you to take on all at once. Because it is a bigger commitment when you think about the time involved. Because if you're DMing, you're not just having to section off that 3 to 5 hour chunk per week. You're also having to prepare for the session, which, depending on how long and how much you need to prep, could be 30 minutes if you're a very low prep DM, or it could be another 3 to 5 hours per session. I know people that will go to great lengths in order to prepare all sorts of handouts and maps, and it really does at least double the time that they have to spend per week on this hobby. So I think a lot of times we talk about how do you become a good DM? How do you become a good player? And that's all good advice, but it's all about what happens once you're at the table. We don't talk enough about getting to the table and the commitment required in order to do that well. And the last bit of advice that I'll say, and I know this from experience as well, it's related to your personal limits. is when you're playing, be cognizant of your workload, both within D&D and outside of it, because if it gets to be too much, if it gets to be too much of a commitment, that's when it can start to feel like an obligation that's a negative. And you never want the hobby to become that. You always want it to be something that you look forward to. So as soon as you start to pile too much onto your plate, it's going to turn and it's going to become a negative. And I think that's one of the worst things that can happen, because this really should be a fun hobby for everyone who is involved. So if you go from 1 game to 2, or 2 games to 3, or whatever it might be, or if you go from meeting twice a month to every week, whatever it may be along those lines, keep an eye on your stress level, how much you're feeling like you have to scramble either to prepare for D&D or to get other things done in your life. And if it does get to be too much, that's another opportunity to communicate with your group to sort of set expectations and say, hey, I'm struggling with this a little bit. It's not working for me as well as it did. And maybe you can come to some sort of conclusion that's going to make it easier on you. And what do those sorts of conclusions look like? Well, maybe you're running a game and it's more work than you anticipated and you're struggling a little bit. Well, maybe someone else wants to run some one-shots so that you're only having to run your campaign every other week instead of every week. So now you have more time to prep, and you can either skip those one-shots if you really need a week off, or you can show up as a player and you don't have to worry as much about preparing in advance. And the reverse is true if things get added to, you can go from 1 campaign to 2, or you can stay at 2, say you're at 2 campaigns. And you can stay at 2 campaigns, but then if other stuff gets added to your outside life, outside of D&D and role-playing games, then it can have the same effect. And this is what happened to me at one point. I was into 2 groups, and I happened to be running. I was DMing both at the same time. So one group was, I think it was me as DM the whole time, and then the other one we would sort of jump back and forth. But at this particular time, I was DMing both. And I started classes for a master's program. And I said to myself, well, I kind of have the hang of DMing by this point. I don't think it's going to be that hard. And it turned out to be that hard. And the amount of free time that I lost as a result of my master's classes was profound. And I quickly became inundated with a feeling of anxiety toward preparing D&D. So the one group, we ended up splitting, and I'm still friends with all of them. They're great people, and we may play again in the future, but there were a couple others who had things going on in their life as well that made it harder for them to play D&D, and so the group just sort of naturally and amicably dissolved. And with the other group, I said, okay, I think once this campaign is over, I'm going to step back for a little bit until I hit a new equilibrium. And I haven't jumped back into the DM's chair with that group since that time, and probably won't until I'm on the other end of my degree program, just because I know how much extra time I like to spend preparing some of those types of things for the game, and how much time I lose because of my coursework. So it's a very good thing overall for me in my life, but it does limit what I can do in D&D. And being cognizant of that, communicating about those things, and making sure that you have the right balance is key, because otherwise you are going to get exhausted, you're going to burn out. We talk about DM burnout, but it can be player burnout, or it can be burnout from other things in your life that aren't D&D, but it'll affect D&D. So all of these are things that I think you need to be aware of, and that are good to have conversations about, because everybody's lives change. That's change is the only constant, that old chestnut. And it really is true. So the situation that works for your group in 1 year probably won't in the next year or the one after that for one or more people. So finding ways to adapt to make it work, I think, is key. So I'm kind of impressed with myself. I didn't mention ghosting once in reference to online dating, which I think is where the term comes from. And obviously I'm mentioning it now, but I could have gone on a whole rant, because I've done online dating, it's fine, but holy hell, people ghost you left and right. And I've talked to women who have people ghost them, men who have people ghost them. It isn't one gender or another. It isn't one type of person or another. It isn't one sexual orientation. People just ghost each other, and it's exhausting. I want to I don't know. So don't ghost people when it comes to D&D. Don't ghost people on Tinder. Becky, I'm joking. I don't know any Beckys, but don't ghost anyone. All right, bye.